么首先我也是欢迎马丁先生welcome。第一个问题是，2009年当中国统治世界这本书出版以后，你对中国做出了很多乐观的预测。那么如今你怎么来看待当时的这些文字
？Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Guancha and Chris and the team for organising this event, and I'd like to thank you all for coming on your Sunday afternoon to listen. In my book, When China Rules the World, which this is the latest edition of, but the first edition was published in the UK in June 2009. And I made about five key arguments in it. First of all, that China would overtake the United States by the mid-2020s to become the largest economy in the world. Secondly, that the process of westernization globally, as well as for China, had probably peaked, and in future we would see increasingly the rise of Chinese influence, or what I called a process of Sinicization. Thirdly, that the Chinese economy, that the Chinese political system, far from being fragile, was actually strong, robust, and rooted, and it would get stronger in the future. And my last point here would be that Chinese modernity would not be like Western modernity. It would borrow, and has borrowed, from Western modernity, and will continue to borrow, but it will remain very different, very specific, and very unique. One final point to add to those four, and that is China would not be simply an economic power. I think this is worth remembering because things have changed so much, that as late as 2009, the world's impression of China, the impact of China on the world, and China's own self-image was still overwhelmingly economic. China was an economic phenomenon. And my argument was that this was only a stage, a phase. And as China rose, it would become much more than just an economic phenomenon. It will become a political phenomenon, cultural phenomenon, military phenomenon, moral phenomenon, intellectual phenomenon. In other words, China would increasingly acquire the characteristics, if you like, of a very influential global power. Of course, there was a lot of other things that I argued in the book. I mean, for example, that China was, and I was the first to argue this really, that China was a civilization state primarily and only secondarily a nation state, and lots of other things as well, but I don't need to elaborate on that now. The point I want to make is that these constellation of arguments in the book at the time were not the conventional wisdom, not the common sense, not the way, certainly in the Western world, China was seen or interpreted. And even in China, at this point, China was not really seen quite like this. And I think that was, when the book first came out in China, it got a wonderful coverage. But I think it was, even in China, regarded, not just because of the title, as quite controversial. Now, the extraordinary thing is that, now we're in 2017. It's only 8 years after the book was published. And there's been a really sea change in attitudes. I don't think I think most of my propositions at least in some degree, in some respects totally, would now be seen as a statement of fact. That is exactly what has happened. So history has moved much faster than I anticipated. I mean, I was rather regarded as probably okay, it's very interesting, it's controversial, he's probably got a lot of things wrong. That was, I suppose, the way the book was seen. But in fact, two things. One, the arguments, I think every single one of the arguments that I advanced earlier has been basically proved true. And secondly, to be quite frank with you, the process has happened much more quickly than even I anticipated.
就是过去我们提到的是2009年，您写那本书的时候，那么现在的世界大势，您认为是怎么样的呢？
Well, I think the biggest single reason why things have moved much faster than I anticipated, or anyone anticipated for that matter, concerns the Western financial crisis. And basically, I would argue that since the Western financial crisis of 2007-8, we have moved into a new era. And that era is characterized by the divergent fortunes of China on the one hand and the United States on the other. And this has opened up a very new situation. And basically, China has carried on going from strength to strength, and the West, and not least the United States, have actually become extremely crisis-ridden. Now, if we can look at some slides, here the top line, they're slightly out of date, the lines. I've drawn them slightly differently now, but the top line is China, but you can see that the crisis is where it spikes down and then recovers, but never recovers properly. And then you see the relatively parallel lines of the United States, Europe, and Japan. And basically, this is these graphs are giving us the percentage change in gross domestic product year by year since the financial crisis. I mean, basically, the conclusion you could draw from this graph and what's happened is that the West has largely suffered a lost decade. Remember, for Japan, the lost decade was basically the 1990s, although it eventually became more like 3 decades. The West has basically lost at least a decade. This second graph is actually about the UK, but it tells you a lot about the consequences for ordinary people of the severity of this crisis. This is real wages in Britain from 2005 to 2017. And you'll see that real wages have never recovered. They stopped growing. And in fact, real wages in Britain now are lower than they were in 2007. And the prospect is, the projection is, that real wages in Britain will not recover to the level of 2007 until 2024. Now this bar chart here, you begin to grasp why the Western countries are having a lot of political problems now. This is comparing a range of different countries, and it's the chart is the proportion of households with flat or falling real incomes in the period 2012 to 2005 to 2012 or 14. And you'll see here, you know, that, say, I mean, this is dramatic really. Look at Italy. Hardly anyone in Italy over this 10-year period has experienced rising living standards. In America, only less than 20% of the population is 10 years has experienced rising living standards. Most, it's flat, great majority is flat, or it's falling. UK, I've just described. Netherlands, a little bit better. France, slightly better than that. But if you look at the bottom here, weighted average of 25 advanced economies, that's basically all the advanced economies, most of which, the majority of which are Western, and you can see that something just under 70% of the population have suffered either flat or falling real incomes. Now that is an extraordinary picture. And you can contrast what's been happening in the West with what's been happening in China over the same period, or slightly longer period, but since 2000 to 2020, real incomes have risen very rapidly in China since around about 2005. You know, the assumption in Western society throughout my lifetime, probably the whole of the last century, if not longer, has been that your children will enjoy a better standard of living than you have. So the assumption has been that your kids will be better off than you. And this crisis has thrown this assumption, or rather reversed this assumption for many people living in the West. Now this side here are all of these countries here. The majority of people think that their children will do better than they have done. And this side here, people think the opposite, that their children will do worse. So there's tremendous contrast between developing countries and Western developed countries and Japan. So here's China. 74% think that their kids will do better than they have. India, and then various other countries, Indonesia, Thailand, Brazil, and so on. The United States is here, where a slight majority think their kids will do better, but it's pretty close to even. In other words, nearly half of Americans think their kids will do worse than they did. This is unprecedented. I think it's probably unprecedented in American history, ever. And then these are the countries that think that their kids will do worse. And oh, by the way, the UK is in the middle here. 50-50. And then these are mainly European countries, Australia and so on, and as you'll see, very pessimistic. And I think somewhere is, remember, Italy is there, where a substantial majority think that the kids are going to do worse, and worst of all, Japan. Now, not surprisingly, this economic situation has had profound political repercussions. I mean, at first, that was not true. In the years, say, from 2010 to 2013-14, there remained relative political instability. But over the last 2 or 3 years, as we all know now, there's been growing political instability and rising discontent in most Western countries. The governing elites are now, there's deep disillusionment in the governing elites, deep disillusionment in most established political parties. growing disillusionment in the political, in the institutions of governance, and this has both been most clearly reflected in the election of Trump as American president and in Britain's decision to vote to leave the European Union, Brexit. And I think it's worth remembering in this context that the Western view about China has, at least until recently, but I think still true to some extent, but certainly until recently, was very pessimistic about the prospects for China. The belief was that China's economic transformation, rapid though it has been, was unsustainable, and there would be some kind of profound economic crisis in the West, in China. And this was related to another belief in the West, which was China's political system was unsustainable unless it moved in the direction of a Western-style democracy. In other words, China as it was could not survive in the long run. This was a transient period of economic growth and relative political stability. Now, the joke is, if you like, the joke, is that that economic crisis never happened in China, nor did the political crisis. On the contrary, the economic crisis happened in the West, especially in the United States, the worst economic crisis the West has seen since 1931, and the political crisis never happened in China, it happened in the West, and there is no sign of a resolution of that political crisis.
那么刚才我们讨论了，就是世界总体而言现在发展到了一个什么样的位置。那么我接下来想问马林雅克先生的是，现在的中国处于一个什么样的位置上？
So, okay, that's the West for the time being. So what about China since the Western financial crisis? And the situation couldn't be more contrasting. I mean, China continued to grow, not quite as quickly as before, but a growth rate of 6 to 8% is still, in the present conditions of the global economy, a very fast growth rate, and that has been sustained. Of course, as we know, in 2014, according to the International Comparison Program of the World Bank, the Chinese economy overtook the size of the American economy, measured by GDP, primary purchasing power. And now the Chinese economy is about 15 to 20%, by this measure, larger than the American economy. But I would argue that, in general, since the Western financial crisis, what's characterized China is what I would describe as a paradigm shift in 3 different respects. Now, the first paradigm shift is a recognition which, of course, predates 2012, predates Xi, but it was really with Xi Jinping that this became articulated in a new way. And that was the need to shift the nature of the Chinese economy from one which was very good at producing cheap goods based on cheap labour for overseas markets to an economy which was increasingly innovative, value-added, and was geared as much, if not more, to the domestic market as to the global market. The second aspect, I think, of the paradigm shift is eloquently summed up by Xi Jinping's invocation of the Chinese dream. Actually, it's inconceivable that the idea of a Chinese dream could have been conceived during what I'll call the era of Deng Xiaoping, which is from roughly 1978 until 2012. Why? Because China in this period was very poor, was pretty weak, and people, your parents, grandparents, were required to make enormous sacrifices to pull China up by, always say in English, by its bootstraps and escape from poverty. And what now was offered to the Chinese people was a completely different kind of future to the 30 years or so that they'd experienced since 1978 and the beginning of the economic reform period. First of all, a transformed living conditions, quality of life, levels of prosperity, and so on. And secondly, the second offer was that China's place in the world could now be transformed. And in some ways, this is the most dramatic of all, in my view, because by the end of the 19th century, China had become so weak that it essentially had to live in the world on the terms of the West. There's a marvelous quote from a very, very good American writer on China, who's now dead, Lucian Pye. And Lucian Pye said, "China is a civilization pretending to be a nation state, forced by its own weakness at the end of the 19th century to adapt to the European norms of the international system." In other words, China could now begin to look forward to the prospect of being what it is, of aligning itself in some profound way with its history rather than the consequences of the century of humiliation. And the third aspect of this paradigm shift concerned exactly this question, which is, China's role in the world. Now, China had been criticized, especially by the US, after it joined the WTO in 2001, for being what was described as a free rider on the global economy, on and in the global economy, that it was using the public goods but not paying for them. And of course there was some truth in this, although China's response, I think, was totally justified. Look, we're new to this game, we're still a relatively poor developing country, it'll take time for us to do this. But starting in 2012, we began to see a really dramatic shift. In particular, as expressed, firstly, with the formation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, and then, of course, even much more dramatically, was the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, in a very short space of time, really, we're only talking about 2 or 3 years. China moves from a situation where essentially it is relatively passive with regard to the global system, the global economy, and the global polity, to a situation where it is proposing by far the most ambitious global project ever conceived in modern times. Or to put it very succinctly, China has become a maker and a shaper of globalization.
马利亚克先生，您刚才提到了西方在金融危机之后所呈现出的面貌，也提到了中国这几年来所呈现出的发展趋势。那么这两大趋势，这两大截然相反的趋势，对我们来说意味着什么呢？
I mean, the acceleration of events which I started by talking about, is a consequence of these two very divergent experiences. China on the one hand, the West on the other. And these divergent experiences have created what I would describe as a new kind of political moment, a new kind of historical moment, a new kind of conjuncture, which we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we can have some ideas about it. Here you have China on the one hand. I mean, and really it is a very different phenomenon, different kind of China in many ways from what it was just a few years ago. Very ambitious, very successful, very outward looking, and increasingly confident. I mean, let's give some examples of this. I mean, first of all, it seems to me that China is now characterized by what I'll call an innovative surge. You remember the Western mantra used to be, okay, you know, good at imitation, good at copying, but when it comes to innovation, you know, the Chinese, well, maybe they'll never be able to do it, or certainly it will take quite a long time. This is just not true, but the speed with which it's happened is quite extraordinary. I mean, one's got to bear in mind here that in many areas of technology, in the major technology companies were all based in Silicon Valley. You know, firms like Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and so on. And do you know how many European firms there were in this area? I mean, I'll tell you how many there. 0. No European firms. And yet, in an extraordinarily short space of time, a number of Chinese companies, like Tencent, like Alibaba, like Huawei, and so on, have become increasingly rivals to Silicon Valley, and in some areas like mobile technology are now, at the admission of many people in Silicon Valley, in advance of the American technology companies. Who would have thought this? So here, this is not market capitalization by size. This is a different way of measuring, but this is by brand. And you'll see, look, Tencent, this is 11th ranked. This was in 2016, so it'll be higher now. Come back to that in a moment. Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, Huawei. Now, if I had shown you this this kind of league 5 years ago, they wouldn't be there, and it would be dominated by China Mobile would have been there, the banks would have been there, Sinopec would have been there, but none of these new technology companies. In other words, not only have these technology companies arrived on the global scene very quickly and are challenging the American leaders in this area, but also it is, of course, resulting in the restructuring of the Chinese economy. And just during this last week, Tencent became the first Chinese technology firm to, as it were, join the really big American league with a market capitalization of over $500 billion. And in the same week, Tencent has overtaken Facebook in market capitalization. So the top 5 are now, let's get this right, first Apple, second Microsoft, third Google, fourth Tencent, fifth Facebook. A second example of this new phenomenon is something I've already said. I won't go into detail, but I mean it is the whole Belt and Road Initiative, and I mean this is a transformative project that's going to take decades. But I think its chances of reconfiguring the globe and the global economy and the global polity are quite strong. And I think this is, of course, attracting a lot of interest, varying across continents, varying between countries. But I mean, just bear in mind, there's only one modern similar project, and that was Marshall Aid at the end of the Second World War, which was America's aid to reconstruct Europe after the Second World War. And at today's prices, Belt and Road is 12 times bigger than, as it is at present, 12 times bigger than Marshall Aid. And to move on, the third characteristic of what I'll call this new mood, this new sense of confidence, I think, was the 19th Congress of the Communist Party last month. I mean, I think this Congress was the first time that a Congress of the Communist Party of China has not just been basically a national event. This time it was also a global event. In other words, China is moving from being a factor, but an outside factor in the global polity, to increasingly registering itself as a norm, if you like, moving from the outside to becoming progressively normative. This is a new experience for China. The further factor, I think, is, which I find interesting, some ways intriguing, and that is the new emphasis being placed by Xi and the Chinese leadership, a new emphasis on something which is quite old, starts with Deng Xiaoping at the 1982 Congress of the CPC, which is socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, I think that by and large, over the recent decades, China's gone quite quiet on this. You know, it's still being used, but to use an Italian phrase, sotto voce, which means softly, softly, quietly, quietly. It's borrowed from Italian opera, actually. And I think that's, broadly speaking, how it's been done. But I think this new emphasis is, this new approach is about saying that China is not just different for cultural reasons or historical reasons, but also there are enduring systemic differences between China's political project and that of the West. A further illustration of, I think, this new mood, this new sense of optimism and confidence is the exuberance of the generation now in their, I don't know, let's say 18 to 30, something like that. You know, the WeChat generation, the cashless society, the bike sharing phenomenon. I mean, these are very interesting developments because these are kind of expressions, in a way, of a lifestyle. You know, everyone always used to look to the United States for new things and so on. But each of these things, you know, is the world is increasingly looking to China. I mean, Mobike can offer exporting their bike sharing around the world, and you know, your cashless society is far in advance of anything that exists in my country or in the United States. In other words, you know, it's not just in the, as it were, high politics and so on, we're thinking of China. It's actually in the popular culture that increasingly China is now beginning to have and will have increasingly a global impact on the way in which ordinary people across the world think, including in the West. So, I suppose to finish this bit off, although I don't think the Chinese government would quite put it like this, but I will put it like this, that China increasingly now sees itself as a world leader.